January 2015, Theranos Inc. was valued at $9 billion. It employed nearly 800 people. Its founder graced the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Time. Walgreens had opened Theranos wellness centers inside 40 of its stores. Safeway had spent $66 million retrofitting its pharmacies to host the technology. Investors, patients, and partners had all been told the same thing, that a single drop of blood drawn from a finger prick could run hundreds of diagnostic tests with the accuracy of a hospital laboratory. It was a compelling promise. It was also, according to the United States Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, a lie. The machines at the center of that $9 billion empire could not do what the company said they could do. In many cases, they could not do very much at all. Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of Stanford University's School of Engineering in 2003 at the age of 19. She had been studying chemical engineering and had spent a summer interning at the Genome Institute of Singapore, where she had helped process blood samples. That experience planted an idea. She founded a company she initially called Real-Time Cures, later renamed Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. The founding premise was elegant in its ambition. Miniaturize blood testing technology so completely that a small cartridge and a compact analyzer could perform the same work as a full clinical laboratory, using only the tiny volume of blood obtainable from a fingertip rather than a vein. Holmes filed an early patent application and began raising capital. The first investors believed in both the technology and the founder. She was young, she was articulate, and she had a vision that resonated with a healthcare system widely seen as expensive, inaccessible, and intimidating. The pitch was simple. Make blood testing cheap, fast, and painless, and you could democratize medicine itself. By the mid-2000s, Theranos had attracted serious funding and serious attention. Holmes cultivated a board of directors that was, by any measure, extraordinary for a startup. Former Secretary of State George Shultz joined. Former Secretary of Defense William Perry joined. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger joined. Former Senators Bill Frist and Sam Nunn joined. General James Mattis, who would later serve as Secretary of Defense, joined. The board was heavy with statesmen, military leaders, and policy figures. It was notably light on clinical laboratory scientists or diagnostic medicine specialists. Holmes modeled her public persona carefully. She adopted a uniform of black turtlenecks, a deliberate echo of Steve Jobs. Her voice, according to those who knew her at Stanford, deepened measurably over the years into a low, deliberate baritone she deployed in interviews and presentations. She spoke about disruption, about empowerment, about her own fear of needles as the emotional engine behind the company's mission. The story was irresistible to media. Fortune named her the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. Forbes placed her net worth at $4.5 billion at the company's peak valuation. The New Yorker profiled her. President Obama appointed her a United States ambassador for global entrepreneurship. Partners lined up. Walgreens signed on in 2010, eventually opening Theranos wellness centers in its stores across Arizona and California. Safeway negotiated a deal and spent $66 million on store renovations before a single test was run commercially. The United States Army explored the technology's potential for battlefield diagnostics. And through all of it, patients were going to Walgreens locations, pricking their fingers, and receiving test results that would inform real medical decisions about real lives. The company's internal reality, however, was diverging sharply from its public presentation. The Theranos proprietary analyzer was called the Edison. A later, smaller version was called the Minilab. Both were central to every claim the company made about its revolutionary technology. The Edison was supposed to run a full panel of blood tests from a single fingertip prick sample, automatically, within hours, inside a device small enough to sit on a countertop. The problem, according to testimony and evidence presented in the federal criminal trial, United States versus Holmes, was that the Edison could not reliably perform most of the tests Theranos advertised. Internal documents introduced at trial showed that laboratory staff had identified persistent accuracy and precision problems with the device across multiple test categories. For tests where the Edison's performance fell short, Theranos did not disclose the limitation to patients or ordering physicians. Instead, the company often ran samples on commercially available third-party analyzers made by companies like Siemens, then reported those results as if they had been generated by Theranos technology. Critically, even when using those third-party machines, Theranos was diluting fingertip blood samples to obtain enough volume, a modification that laboratory scientists testified could materially affect result accuracy for certain analytes. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, known as CMS, conducted an inspection of the Theranos Newark, California laboratory in 2015. Their findings were severe. CMS determined that the laboratory posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. The agency cited deficiencies in quality control, proficiency testing, and laboratory director oversight. CMS ultimately moved to revoke Theranos's federal laboratory certification and ban Holmes from operating or owning a clinical laboratory for a period of 2 years. These were not minor regulatory citations. They were the conclusions of federal health inspectors who had reviewed the actual laboratory operations firsthand. The human consequences were not abstract. Theranos tests had returned results suggesting patients had conditions they did not have, and results that failed to flag conditions they did. A former Theranos laboratory director, according to trial testimony, had raised concerns about result accuracy internally. Employees who expressed doubts faced pressure. Some left. Some signed non-disclosure agreements. The company's legal apparatus, run by a prominent Silicon Valley law firm, sent threatening letters to former employees and journalists who began asking questions. One of those journalists was John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal. Carreyrou had been contacted by sources inside and outside the company. He began reporting in 2015. Holmes and Theranos pushed back aggressively. The company arranged for prominent allies to publicly defend it. Holmes appeared on television to dismiss the journal's reporting as factually incorrect, but Carreyrou's sources multiplied and his documentation deepened. His first major story ran in October 2015 under the headline, "Hot Startup Theranos has struggled with its blood test technology." The story described the company's reliance on conventional machines, the accuracy concerns, and the gap between public claims and internal performance. Theranos disputed every major finding. The dispute did not last. Within weeks of publication, federal regulators arrived at the Newark laboratory. The inspection that followed produced the CMS findings that would become central to both the regulatory action and the subsequent criminal case. The company's valuation, still nominally $9 billion on paper, had begun its irreversible descent. And a former president of the company, Ramesh Balwani, who had joined Theranos in 2009 and served as its chief operating officer, was now squarely in the investigative frame alongside Holmes. The Securities and Exchange Commission filed a civil complaint against Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Balwani in March 2018. The complaint alleged that they had raised more than $700 million from investors through an elaborate, years-long fraud. It described a scheme in which Holmes and Balwani had made false statements about the capabilities of the Edison device, about the company's revenue projections, about its contracts with the United States military, and about its use of third-party analyzers. Holmes settled with the SEC without admitting or denying the allegations. Under the terms of the settlement, she paid a fine of $500,000, was barred from serving as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years, and returned shares in Theranos. Balwani did not settle and contested the SEC's allegations. The Department of Justice moved separately and with greater consequence. In June 2018, a federal grand jury in the Northern District of California returned indictments against both Holmes and Balwani on charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged two separate schemes, one targeting investors, one targeting patients. The investor fraud count alleged that Holmes and Balwani had knowingly misrepresented Theranos' technology and financial condition to obtain funding. The patient fraud count alleged that they had deceived patients who relied on Theranos test results for medical decisions. Holmes and Balwani were tried separately. Holmes's trial began in August 2021 in San Jose, California. It lasted nearly 4 months. The government called former Theranos employees, investors, patients, and laboratory scientists. Witnesses described being shown falsified validation reports. Investors testified that they had been given documents containing inflated revenue figures. A former Theranos scientist testified about being instructed to use a third-party Siemens analyzer for tests the Edison could not perform, while the results were reported under the Theranos name. Holmes took the stand in her own defense. She testified that she had genuinely believed in the technology, that she had been a victim of Balwani's control and manipulation, and that she had not intended to defraud anyone. The jury deliberated for approximately 7 days. On January 3rd, 2022, the jury returned its verdict. Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts. 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors, and 3 counts of wire fraud against investors. She was acquitted on counts related to the patient fraud scheme. On November 18, 2022, Judge Edward Davila sentenced Holmes to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. She was also ordered to pay restitution. Holmes appealed the conviction and the sentence, but the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld both in November 2024. Balwani was tried separately in 2022. His jury found him guilty on all 12 counts, including both the investor and patient fraud schemes. He was sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison. Theranos itself had already ceased operations entirely in September 2018, after running out of money and surrendering its laboratory licenses. The $9 billion company dissolved without ever having commercialized a single validated proprietary blood test. The investors who had funded it, including prominent venture capital firms and wealthy individuals, lost their entire investments. Walgreens settled litigation related to the partnership. Safeway, which had never launched its Theranos centers commercially, had already written off its $66 million renovation expenditure years before the criminal verdicts arrived. The material damage from Theranos is quantifiable. Investors lost hundreds of millions of dollars in capital that will not be recovered. Walgreens paid a reported $30 million to settle a lawsuit brought by a patient who alleged she had received inaccurate test results. The company's laboratory partners, retail chains and suppliers, absorbed losses of their own. But the damage that resists easy quantification is the one that matters most to regulators and to the medical community. The harm done to patients who made health decisions based on results that federal inspectors had determined were unreliable. CMS's finding of immediate jeopardy was not a bureaucratic formality. It was a clinical judgment that people's safety had been placed at risk. The legal proceedings that followed the collapse reshaped how the venture capital and startup community in Silicon Valley discussed the concept of fake it till you make it, a phrase that had long circulated in technology culture as a kind of permissive shorthand for projecting confidence ahead of capability. The Theranos case drew a documented, prosecuted line between projecting confidence and committing fraud. That line, it turned out, was crossed when false statements were made to investors who were relying on accurate information to make financial decisions, and when patients received diagnostic results from a system whose operators knew those results could not be validated. The regulatory response extended beyond the criminal verdicts. The CMS findings accelerated a broader review of the laboratory-developed test regulatory framework in the United States. For years, a regulatory gap had existed. Laboratory-developed tests, meaning tests designed and run within a single laboratory rather than sold as commercial kits, faced less rigorous FDA oversight than commercially distributed diagnostics. Theranos had operated within that gap. The case became a reference point in subsequent legislative and regulatory discussions about closing it. Holmes reported to federal prison in May 2023 to begin serving her sentence, following the denial of her request to remain free during her appeal. Balwani began serving his sentence in 2023 as well. Neither has any remaining ownership interest of value. The Theranos brand, the Edison device, the mini lab, the patents, and the remaining assets were liquidated. Nothing of commercial value survived. The investors who sat on that celebrated board, the statesmen and generals and policy architects, were never charged. The record shows they were deceived along with everyone else. Their presence, however, raises a structural question that the verdict itself does not answer. What does rigorous oversight of a company actually require, and who is responsible for performing it? The lesson the Theranos case leaves in the record is precise and unadorned. In healthcare, the gap between a compelling claim and a validated result is not a detail to be resolved later. It is the entire foundation. When that gap is concealed rather than closed, the consequences fall not on the company, but on the patients who never knew there was a gap at all.